The Powhatan people living here in what will become the Virginia area, that is the tribe you might have heard of with Pocahontas. Pocahontas was indeed the one of the daughters of Chief Powhatan, and so that is the beginning of the English settlement with the colony of Jamestown, right around here. That's going to begin in 1607. So that is the Powhatan people there on the Tidewater in the Virginia area. Oh, and by the way, Virginia, that is actually, named by the English. John Smith was actually a real character and all that, and we'll talk about it. But that is named after the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth I. That is how Virginia got its name there. All right, so New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia. Now, here in the Southeast, the American Southeast, that's the Carolinas over here, Georgia. You got Alabama, Mississippi, you got Louisiana, and Florida. In the American Southeast over here, you have the five civilized tribes, they're called. And that's actually going to be the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Seminole. Seminole will be in Florida. And those five civilized tribes we will talk about later with Andrew Jackson. When the war hero Andrew Jackson is president in the 1830s, he will order the forced removal of the five civilized tribes, they are called, because they tried to negotiate legally for their right to own that land. And they were denied by the U.S. government, and that will be the awful and tragic trail of tears of the five civilized tribes. Now, here in Texas, especially in the Waco area and a little bit east of us, like in Groesbeck and stuff, very important is the Comanche. Comanche were a Plains Indians tribe, and the Plains Indians, like the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, the Comanche, the Apache, these Plains Indian warriors were totally transformed by the horse. Horses came over beginning in 1492 of Christopher Columbus. And as the Spanish had more and more missions established in the American Southwest, like here in New Mexico, in Arizona, and in Texas, they brought with them their horses. And some of these horses turned wild, some of them were stolen, and eventually Native Americans and the horses got together and they became a powerful and formidable force on the plains. Natives who had previously been forced to hunt the buffalo on foot, a very, very dangerous thing. These are creatures that weigh thousands of pounds, and buffalo hunting was one of the most dangerous things you could do. Now found themselves able to keep up and hunt the buffalo so much easier with the horse. And everything that these Plains Indians had came from the buffalo. They wore their hides, their teepees were made out of buffalo leather, their hides. They used the bones for tools. They even used the buffalo poop, the manure, the dung for their fires for fuel. Nothing was wasted. And of course, later on during the Indian Wars, after the Civil War, this is going to be the 1870s, much later on, the American government will wage a sort of war against the buffalo itself to try to basically have war of attrition against the Native Americans to starve them out since they relied so heavily upon the buffalo. The Nez Perce is another interesting native group that we'll look at here in the American Northwest. And the Nez Perce, especially like Chief Joseph, again in that era of the Indian Wars after the American Civil War, this was a tribe that is going to be pushed off their land like so many, and who took an interesting route of revolution. They fled in an amazing escape effort over 1,000 miles on their famous Appaloosa horses, trying to escape the U.S. cavalry, and almost made it to the Canadian border before being routed, sadly, to Indian country in Oklahoma eventually. Um, and the American Southwest tribes are very interesting. The Anasazi, of course, with their ancient and elaborate cities built into the canyons. The Hopi and the Zuni and the Navajo, many different advanced irrigation methods. Some of the most advanced Native American cultures in all of the continental United States, which is what we call this area, were found right here in the Southwest. Agriculture, farming, this is another misconception that a lot of people have, is that Native Americans were backward because they didn't have a written language like Europeans at the time. When we get to Columbus's time, we're talking about. So think the 15th century. Um, but Even if they lacked a written language, they had a rich oral tradition. And as far as agriculture goes, actually, they were not lacking. They only lacked in animal husbandry compared to Europeans. It is true that there wasn't a lot of animals to domesticate in the Americas. You think, in the Americas they had turkey. They did have some wild dogs. They had deer. It wasn't a whole lot. Versus in Europe, you had cows and pigs and sheep and horses, all kinds of things. But as far as agriculture goes, you think of Europeans, peasants living in the feudal lifestyle, farming rows and rows of the same crop, year after year. Well, that wears out the soil, and you get a lot of problems with that. Native Americans overcame this difficulty and did a more natural, nurturing, pro environmental approach to agriculture that yielded a much better result with their milpas. And that's where they'd farm all sorts of different crops together in the same area. It kind of looks like this picture down here. And this advantage is that different crops take different nutrients, and so the soil doesn't get as worn out. And so that's actually a much more effective method of agriculture, much more advanced actually than what Europeans were using. Another misconception is that natives were backward in appearance or hygiene, but many were very, very clean and hygienic, especially compared to Europeans at the time. Remember, um, that when we're talking about Europe in the Middle Ages, and even the High Middle Ages, and the time when we get to Columbus and all this, after the Renaissance, and while that's happening, that Europeans were pretty disgusting. They would have their, how do I put this delicately? Their buckets full of their stuff, their urine and their waste products that would be disposed of by dumping it out into the streets from their windows. They didn't have proper sewage systems. They didn't have what we call latrines for the waste really to run into a sewage or out of the city. So a lot of that would just sit there. And of course, if you have raw sewage sitting in an urban area, a city, it's going to attract what? Yeah. Ugh. Flies, vermin, all kinds of nasty, nasty stuff. And most of that nasty stuff it's going to attract is also going to bring with it disease. And so Native Americans who washed and who were much more hygienic about their, waste disposal and other things, they actually lived a lot cleaner than most Europeans at the same time. Now, surplus of food, let's talk about two important staple crops. Staple crop is like the main crop that a person or a society lives off of. And that is going to be for Native Americans, especially in the United States and in Central America, maize, which is corn, of course. Gold, because there's not going to be a whole lot of gold in the United States per se, but corn was almost worth its weight in gold, especially when you factor in its caloric value. Corn is very high in calories, as are potatoes. And potatoes are going to be a lot more important in South America with the Incas. But corn, that's where the calories are at. If you've ever watched The Martian or you've read Andy Weir's, book The Martian, then potatoes and high yielding crops like corn and potatoes very important for survival. And once you have a crop that yields high caloric value and that you can live off of farming and you don't have to do a whole lot of hunting and gathering, then you have the elements right here of civilization. They can sprout up once you have enough food and you can stay in one spot. Language can develop, religions can develop, cities will develop as people are able to stay in one area, farming in that area, and producing enough food for everybody in that city to live off of. A hierarchical power structure or a government, a political system will develop. Who's in charge? How do we select who's in charge? And once you have all these other things, you also get that fifth very important thing that allows for civilization to develop and flourish: specialization. Meaning that not every person, like in the olden days, would have to be a hunter gatherer because now we have people that are designated for farming, feeding everybody else. Some people can afford to do other things with their time. There is time now for people to explore other avenues, to become that lawyer, to become that rhetoric politician, to become an author, to become these other things, besides just worrying about where the next meal will come from. And that is specialization. And that's going to happen with many of these Native American groups, even those in the United States. And this is all before Columbus and getting up to the time period of Christopher Columbus. Now, below the United States in Central America were some of the most dominant, powerful Native American empires. The Mayans on the Yucatan, that's in southeastern Mexico, they're going to disappear before the Europeans really come on the scene. But they don't actually disappear, they disperse because we don't know what led to the fall of Mayan civilization, but they kind of abandoned their cities, they abandoned their beautiful pyramids, which you could still go and visit in the Yucatan. Um, Maybe it was a climatic event. Maybe it was wars. We don't quite know for sure, but they did have very advanced systems of language, even a system of hieroglyphic writing, a calendar, of course, that's become very famous with its, ending in 2012, but actually that's just when it recycled. But the Mayans will help inform a lot of Aztec culture. And many of the Mayan people live on, and they help to form one of the bases of Mexican culture today, especially in the southern regions of Mexico, and then parts of other Central American nations like Guatemala down there. The Aztec people were the most powerful group in Central America. The legend goes that the Aztecs were searching for their capital, for a sign from their god, the most important god, their sun god, that said that the image would appear to them where to put their capital. It would be an eagle perched on a cactus with a snake in its mouth. And that told them that that was the place to put their capital, which became Tenochtitlan, which became Mexico City after the Spanish took over. The Aztecs were famous for not only their special ball games that they performed, which kind of is a mixture of soccer, basketball, and lots of other stuff, and lacrosse, but also, of course, their human sacrifices to the sun god, where they would carve out usually an opposing warrior's heart using an obsidian dagger. Very bloodthirsty and all this, but the Aztecs actually had a lot of other stuff going for them, and that's the thing that gets highlighted because, that's interesting with the blood. But Tenochtitlan was an amazing city. Built on this lake where they saw that prophesized vision. They had to do their farming on the Chinapas, these floating islands. The Incan Empire in South America and the Andes is incredible just for how they existed in and among the mountains. And the Incas were the most populous of all of the Native American civilizations prior to the Europeans. Like I said, they had an intricate network of roads. Almost think of like the Roman roads built, thousands of years ago. And the Incas, they had no domesticated animal to run these roads, no wheels. They did it all like on foot. Messengers would run with a message and then deliver it by word of mouth. You'd have to remember that. So just imagine you're out of breath, you're running, and you have like this long thing you have to remember, and then you have to give it off to this next person, and then they have to run and deliver it to the next person. And that was how they transferred messages. The terrace farming, very famous in the mountains of the Incas, is how they farmed on the side of these mountains. The llamas and the alpacas, one of the few domesticated animals that the Incas had. And the Incas also performed sacrifices. The Inca mummy princess, famous example of this. They had their own bloodthirsty ways and other things. They had a civil war that will happen right as Pizarro is coming in, the Spanish are coming in, and that will help divide them and let the Spanish come in and insert themselves. And lastly, with the Incas, they had no written language, but they were incredibly advanced in other ways, not just their architecture and agriculture, but their science. They had an early form of like brain surgery and other stuff, kind of like the Aztecs. Diving into the human body, they knew quite a bit about it. Now, it wasn't advanced by today's standards, but for compared to what Europe was doing, these types of surgeries that they performed, where people actually survived afterward, were very impressive. So where did the Europeans come in? Now that we've looked at, who the natives were that were there, kind of a brief overview. I'm sorry, we don't have more time. Let's look at who the Europeans were and why they were so interested in coming